We had a jolly good time covering the Capcom CP system boards, didn't we? So, here's something else. Sega's System-16 board. Now, why this one in particular? You know what, I'm not even sure myself. A lot of these games actually aren't well known, after all. These were the more regular games that Sega were releasing at the time they were making actual waves in the arcades with their scaler machines, the likes of OutRun, Space Harrier and After Burner. None of those games are here. Instead, there's a lot of games that are, well, also RANs, but also a few classics, and some stuff that's a bit more underrated. This isn't exactly a list that glitters with gold, but there will be a lot of games that aren't very well known, and perhaps should be significantly more well known. So, let's do it. There isn't a hang around, is there? Because Sega did like to produce some arcade machines with rather unique controls back in the day, there's a few System-16 games that I wasn't able to emulate at all. I only have a regular gamepad available to me, alas. They're mostly sports games. We've got Ace Attacker, which is volleyball, the basketball game Dunk Shot, and the most famous of these games, Heavyweight Champ, which was basically Sega's answer to Punch-Out! Obviously, all of these games are unrated as a result. The same also applies to Sukaban Yuki Ryuko, a Mahjong game that uses a proper Mahjong control that assigns one button to every tile. Again, I just didn't think it was fair to put it on the list proper. The first actual listed game then? Well, it's an odd one. It's not a Sega title. It's an unofficial bootleg from South Korea made by a company called Philco. We've got 3 of these games, they're all totally unlicensed, and they're all right here at the bottom of the list. This one, Snapper, well, it's just Snake. Nothing more. As simple as it gets, and certainly not as addictive as it was back on your old Nokia 3210. The first official title to be listed is actually a collaboration between Sega and Sunsoft, and Lord knows a game has to be pretty bloody poor to actually split up the South Korean bootlegs. But my word, Tough Turf is beyond lame. It's a completely derivative title. There's nothing to it beyond wanting to make a cheap little rip-off of Double Dragon, only it's not even nearly as fun. Pure garbage. The second Philco Korean bootleg, amusingly enough, is a rip-off of a Sega arcade game that we're going to see later on in this list. It's called Atomic Point, it's a rip-off of Flashpoint, which in turn is quite heavily inspired by Tetris, although it can be classed as a variation, seeing as the goal of the game is to capture some specific jewels. This is much cheaper and nastier, of course, which is why it's down here. The final Korean bootleg is called Lock On, and again there's nothing original about it whatsoever. Amusingly enough, we've seen it on one of these lists already. It's a total cheap rip-off of Capcom's UN Squadron, or Area 88, only without any of the graphics or charm in that title. Unsurprisingly, Philco soon fell foul of the companies that they were ripping off. Eventually Sega had their guts out both for ripping off Flashpoint and for using the System-16 hardware without permission. And that brings an end to these cruddy little bootlegs. With the Capcom lists, it wasn't long before we reached some real good titles. Doing Sega's System-16, however, gives us much more of a range. We do have a lot of titles that are total balls, and it's going to take a little while longer to start seeing the good stuff. As a result of this, we have a lot more titles that are quite obscure indeed, but for damn good reason. Orwell is a tank shooter made by Sega and West One that tries to do things in both top-down and third-person, and is completely unappealing in both perspectives. Oh dear, White City. We've had the attempt at ripping off Double Dragon, and now we've got the attempt at ripping off Final Fight. It's quite surprising to look at those and think that Sega also made Golden Axe. Perhaps craziest of all, this was made in 1991, the same year that Sega put Streets of Rage out for the Mega Drive. This doesn't even bloody look like an arcade game, to be honest. It looks like a mediocre Mega Drive title. Utter shite. There are a fair few baseball games in this list, more so than any other sport. Now this can be a bit challenging for me, I have to say. They do have their own control system which I can just about emulate, but probably not perfectly. That and in general, I'm just very bad at baseball games. I struggle to time a ball and am totally clueless when it comes to pitching and fielding. I just get hit all over the park for run after run. Still, these games aren't too terrible, I'm just useless. Major League here is mainly the first up because it's an earlier title and thus just doesn't do much in the way of presentation. Sega made a lot of sports titles, but compared to other studios, sport just wasn't really their strong suit back in the day. Unless it was racing, I suppose. But others? Nah. Passing Shot is nothing more than a completely average tennis game, the sort that you have probably played a significant number of over the years. At the very least, Sega would end up producing a very cool tennis game many years from now, but Passing Shot is decidedly not it. More baseball. This is, a later game, so the presentation's a bit more fancier and thus it gets a couple more places. I'm still awful at it, of course. I am curious when it comes to learning how to play these games properly, because I do actually quite like baseball as a sport. I used to have lots of fun watching it on Channel 5 back in the day when they showed live games through the night. So, yeah. If you're looking for a deep critical analysis of this old Sega baseball game, well, I'm afraid you're in the wrong place. Right, here's Time Scanner. It's a game from all the way back in 1987 and, well, it's just a pinball arcade game. I really don't get this. Why would you ever play it? It's an arcade game that chances are you'd have played in an arcade. Most arcades have actual pinball tables to hand, surely. Even the cruddiest pinball table feels better to play than this does. I mean, it's not even a good pinball video game, nowhere near a Dragon's Fury or Pinball Dreams or whatever. Who would even buy this unit? Someone with a very small arcade that can't fit any pinball tables in? Was that perhaps the case in a fair amount of Japanese game centres, meaning there's a chance they might actually put an order in for this dross? That's the only justification I can think of here. It's just crap. When you think of Sega and Sonic Boom nowadays, you probably think of that abomination of a cartoon and game from a few years back, don't you? But actually there's another Sega thing called Sonic Boom that was also pretty cruddy. This here's just a generic top-down shooter from 1987 that misses the mark. It tries to play like the sort of games you'd see from Tower Plan, the slap fights and what have you, but it's nowhere near them. Definitely the sort of game you would completely forget about minutes after playing. Okay, here at number 25 we're about getting into the realm of games that are tolerable. Ryukyu is an obscure little puzzle game with a concept that you don't see too often, at least not in the West. You have a 5x5 grid and you've got to fill it with playing cards. The idea is to make as many winning 5-card poker hands as possible horizontally, vertically and diagonally, enough so that you reach a target score. It's not a game that I'm good at and it's not something I personally would have ever been enticed to play in an arcade, although I give a little bit of credit to the concept for being interesting. Something for the old farts to play while the kids screw around on Super Hanon, I suppose. Next we have Waku Waku Ultraman Racing. It's kind of tricky to really put this one anywhere. It's not exactly all that much of a game, it's more of a kids ride. You know, a more impressive version of the Postman Pat or Thomas the Tank Engine things that you usually find sat forlornly outside of supermarkets. This one has all of this and a display, and the cabinet itself is primarily a big Ultraman head. More of an interesting curio than a game, although you do have to admit it is better than those bloody awful Ultraman fighting games that appeared on the Mega Drive and SNES. Action Fighter might be the first title on the list that I imagine is going to be known by most of the people who are watching, although that doesn't necessarily mean it's a well-liked title. This is basically Sega's attempt at making a Spy Hunter type game, putting you in control of a bike that can shoot and also turn into a plane with the appropriate power-ups. Mainly it's just the sort of game that you have to sink loads of coins into in order to get anywhere. It moves so fast that you end up dying in seconds, usually whenever there's a turn in the road. Quite irritating, really. I prefer this game on the Master System where it's considerably more passable. Woohoo! It's baseball! For the third time. these games do blend into each other a little bit, I'm afraid. Super League here doesn't seem to bear too much in relation to the Mega Drive title of the same name, which some of you may also know as Tommy Lasorda Baseball. Tommy Lasorda being someone who I know for advertising that game, and for quite the most incredible sweary rant against some player who criticised him. Surely a great guy, as great as this game is, well, average and like hundreds of other baseball games. SDI, Strategic Defence Initiative. The original Space Force, let's not forget. Somehow Ronald Reagan's pipe dream got turned into this game. Now, we're still in pretty unoriginal territory. SDI is Sega's take on Missile Command, only with the addition of an offensive half as well as a regular defensive half. The controls are pretty hard to emulate on something like MAME, meaning I kinda struggled to say the least. I do remember it, mind you, and it's probably about as well known as Action Fighter, so it deserves this spot in the middle of the pile. The one and only arcade outing for Sega's Alex Kidd, The Lost Stars sees us still very much in the average portion of this list, although I suppose this is more of a generic platformer and not a game that's specifically derivative of another title. If anything, it's closest to Wonder Boy, meaning that Sega are essentially ripping off themselves. Almost everyone agrees that this game here and Enchanted Castle are the ones who fight it out for the title of most average game in the whole Alex Kidd franchise, I think. Nowhere near as good as Miracle World or Shinobi World, but at least it's not High Tech World. The most notable thing about it is the shrill scream that Alex makes whenever he dies. But at least this starts the top 20 off. And here we have the fourth and best baseball game. MVP is the last baseball title that Sega released on the System-16 hardware, which naturally means that this one's got a bit more flash than the others. But I was actually able to get a bit more of a kick out of this title than I was the other three. It's a perfectly decent baseball game. Sure, it isn't necessarily at the level of SNK's Baseball Stars, and you can find plenty better games out there on the consoles, but this one will do fine. Just about. I mean, I'm still terrible. I think we're now definitely starting to get in the realm of good titles, and this one here, at number 18, is a definite obscurity. Toriumon is an odd one. It's a tile-matching puzzle game that came out as late as 1994, 3 years after the System-16 board had seemingly been retired. It doesn't seem like this happened for any special reason, unlike the other case we're going to see of the board coming out of retirement. It just happened. But hey-ho. This is quite cool. You've got your well, and you have to make big orbs using the tiles. It's actually quite tricky to get your head around. Like many arcade puzzlers of this type, there's also the competitive element, which helps make things quite frantic. Almost no one knows this game, but it's not bad at all. At number 17, the first of two pro wrestling games, both of which are games I have a soft spot for. I particularly like Body Slam in its arcade form because, of course, it allows you to play as the almighty queen of 80s Joshi Pro-Res heels, Dump Matsumoto. You can play as her and the rest of Dump's army in your quest to show those bloody squeaky clean Crush girls what's what. This actually isn't too bad a wrestling game for the 8-bits. It never ended up getting all that good a port on either the Master System or any other platform, which was a bit unfortunate, but I quite like playing the arcade. Up next, well, it's Tetris. There's obviously a big old story when it comes to Sega and Tetris, seeing as it's connected to Tengen and Tetris, Mirrorsoft and Tetris, and so much more. Said story has been told many times, of course, but needless to say, Sega's version of Tetris didn't have all that much time out there on the arcade floor. This is basically the version of Tetris that you can now play on the Mega Drive Mini, by the way. And yeah, it's a perfectly okay version of Tetris. Not bad, but Tengen's arcade version, or Atari's arcade version I suppose, is much better. The Tengen NES version is also much better than Nintendo's one, although obviously the Game Boy Tetris is kin. So there you have it, I suppose. A lot of people don't like Wrestle War all that much, but I can't help but enjoy it a fair bit, even if all the flipping about can be more than a little annoying. It's a cool bit of button bashing mania. You've got your hero who's, well, more than a little bit Inoki-esque actually, and you take on various other rip-offs. There's Road Warriors, a Lord Humongous, and of course a Hulk Hogan. The moves are actually quite cool, being that there's a few of them, including a classic little German suplex, and of course the big old finishing pile driver where you leap 50 foot in the air and come crashing down for an all but guaranteed free count. I don't know, it's kind of rubbish, but I always enjoyed playing it in the arcades and on the Mega Drive. It was great for a very young wrestling fan. And here, an age after we covered a South Korean knockoff version of the game, at number 14 is the proper Flashpoint. And as slight as this may be, I actually do like this little variation on Tetris. You get a whole load of different pre-prepared wells, and you have to try and get rid of the flashing blocks. It does start off pretty basic, but it certainly does get hard. Of course, a lot of that often does depend on how the tetrominos fall and what you do with them. It's a nice little take. Of course, it didn't exactly have much of a chance considering the whole Tetris situation and what have you, although the flash concept did end up making its way into columns later on, so it wasn't totally lost. Near the bottom of the list, we had a lot of titles that were very derivative indeed. Games that were basically rip-offs of Double Dragon, Final Fight, Slap Fight and so on. Beirut, another Sega Sunsoft collaboration with a thoroughly punny name, kinda belongs with that lot. This is most certainly a post-apocalyptic take on Contra, but the big difference is that Beirut is surprisingly a lot of fun to actually play, as well as looking quite nice. Those other titles may have gotten away with being so unoriginal if they weren't also garbage. It's not like Sega were the only folks out there trying to copy the formula of more successful games, after all. But here's one where they actually managed to nail it. A cool little addition to the run and gun field that almost no one has heard of or played. At number 12, here's one of the oddest ones on the whole list. Originally, Fantasy Zone 2 never saw the inside of an arcade. It was a sequel on home consoles only. What changed? Well, when M2 made their big old Sega Ages Fantasy Zone title in 2008, they made their own imagining of Fantasy Zone 2 in arcade form, and they were allowed to do it using the System-16 board. And so Fantasy Zone 2 DX, The Tears of Opa Opa, is an official System-16 game that's been dumped and is playable on MAME, coming out 14 whole years after the last System-16 title, which was Toryumon. And yeah, it works quite nicely. I'm not a huge fan of the game itself. I think that the warping between different parts of a stage in Fantasy Zone 2 is a little unnecessary, and it lacks the quicker pace of the original, but it's not a bad sequel. It's generally more Fantasy Zone, and that's hardly a bad thing. And M2 being M2 did a good job of finally bringing this game to arcades after such a long time. Righty ho, we're starting to get to the big names. We all know Altered Beast, don't we? Altered Beast may not have ever been the fanciest of arcades, seeing that it's pretty much just another side-scroller, but it's certainly memorable. At the very least, getting those orbs and turning into a wolf or a were-dragon or kung fu bear or whatever was definitely rewarding, allowing you to lay enemies utterly to waste with the touch of a button. Weirdly, because of this, it's almost less fun to play the game well, collecting the orbs as soon as possible, and then having much less time to have fun wrecking enemies before fighting the boss. Even if Altered Beast is kind of average, it has a place both in the arcades and as a lot of people's first Mega Drive game. It's top 10 time! We are now at last truly getting into some Sega classics, and first up is Cyber Police eSWAT. This arcade is somewhat unfortunate in that there's an original Mega Drive game, eSWAT City Under Siege, that has kind of taken over from it in most people's minds. Shadow Dancer, which surprisingly isn't a System-16 game, suffered a similar fate. The original eSWAT has a similar lower and upper level thing going on to games like Rolling Thunder, and indeed the game we're going to see in a bit that the developers previously worked on, with the added satisfaction of ripping off Robocop. Play for a couple of levels and then you'll be able to don the big old suit and chuck bullets, missiles and lasers all over the shop. It's one way of trying to coax more coins out of the player basically, isn't it? While the Mega Drive game is clearly better, the original arcade is perfectly fine. Bullet is the most obscure System-16 game in the top 10. It's a bloody good game indeed, but not many people seem to know it, probably because of the very generic title, and also because it never made it out of the arcade. This is a twin-stick shooter, although unlike most that had come out to that point, it isn't a single-screen arena affair like Robotron or Smash TV. Instead, it's got actual scrolling stages, a la Total Carnage. It's quite thematically similar to Alien Syndrome. You've got the choice of either a man or a woman to fight with, and there's loads of monsters to kill, only now they're rampaging all over Earth. As you might expect, it's very tough, particularly because, much like Alien Syndrome again, the game gives you no opportunity to continue. It's not quite as moody as the classic it preceded, but Bullet is an excellent arcade that deserves more love. Up next, we have the very first instalment in Successor's cutesy witch 'em up series, Cotton. Some people may prefer their Cotton in other forms, such as the third-person whale shooter variety, but this original instalment certainly lays the ground for the japes and shenanigans that lay ahead. It's a very nice shooter with a good sense of humour about itself, one with plenty of scope for a big old power-uppage, and it's just amusingly bizarre. I myself do prefer the likes of Panorama Cotton, which came later, but this is very cool too. Also called on the Sharpex 68000, is one of those games where the lights on the keyboard flicker in time to the music, and I think we can all agree that's worth the cost of buying and importing both the computer and the game alone. Right, we've got Quartet next. One of the earliest System-16 games, and also a game that allowed 4 players to go at it at the same time. Hence the name, obviously. Quartet obviously comes way more into its own as a multiplayer experience, but it's not exactly bad in single player mode. It's a sprightly little one and gunner with a classic soundtrack and a bunch of different characters to pick from. It doesn't seem like too much of a game, but once you pick it up, it's difficult to actually stop playing it. And while we're here, let's not forget Quartet 2 either. Now I didn't give that its own separate entry, seeing as it was just a conversion kit that allowed operators to stick the board into a regular 2-player arcade machine, but I thought I should mention it in case anyone was wondering about it. Aside from pretty much always getting this game confused with Monster World, Monster Lair is a little bit of an oddity in the whole Wonder Boy world, as confusing as it is. It does feel like a bit of a throwback to classic original Wonder Boy at a time when the series was getting deeper and deeper into platform adventure, and of course further away from the arcades where it originated. Monster Lair is a cool game though. It's a nice mixture of platforming and shooting, and even if it isn't exactly going to be winning major awards for either of those things, it's still cool here and on the Mega Drive. These System-16 games, for the most part, were never going to be as popular as Sega's bigger scalar arcades, especially because they lacked so much flash in comparison. Monster Lair does suffer a bit from that, but I like it a lot regardless. The top 5 begins with a game that few people remember, and if they do remember it, they don't usually like it. Seriously, almost nobody ever talks about Dynamite Ducks. I mean, I can kinda see why. It's a beat-em-up of sorts by Sega that existed in around about the same time as a much more popular beat-em-up by Sega, not to mention all the other beat-em-ups that are a bit more impressive than this silly little affair where you play as a bloody fighting duck. And yet, I have a massive soft spot for this. It's all very tongue-in-cheek, it keeps throwing weapons your way, and playing it is just a really nice laugh. There are some things that are annoying, like how it's so easy to die very quickly because there's no invincibility or anything, but this one is a guilty pleasure. I enjoy its utter ridiculousness. The top 4 meanwhile doesn't feature too many surprises in terms of games. It's all about the order. And Fantasy Zone, Sega's very cutesy indeed version of Defender, comes fourth. Definitely one of the most memorable cute-em-ups ever. Colourful without being garish, filled with memorable boss designs, a great little weapon system, the lovely Opa Opa ship that would basically be a Sega mascot, and cool music, including one of video games' most iconic bass lines. Everyone with me? You get the idea. So iconic I even did a cover of it many years ago. Justifiably a classic, much tougher than its breezy nature might let on, and it continues to be a Sega gem to this day. Top 3 time! And you may know already just how much I love this one. I did a video all about it. Actually, I've done a video for every game in the top 3, but hey ho. This is Alien Syndrome. It's quite a bit different from a lot of other arcades, a game where the generally pedestrian appearance of a lot of System-16 titles really pays off. The sound is the thing that's most striking, not so much proper music as a relentless thump coming forward. It's kind of close in spirit to Jaws, and that's not a bad thing. The aliens are always coming for you as you try to rescue everyone before the bombs go off. You've got plenty of firepower, but it's easy enough to make a mistake, at which point you'll get a nice healthy scream from your hero. There's some excellent gruesome bosses to take on, lots of play, and lots of challenge. I love pretty much everything about Alien Syndrome. It's one of my favourite arcades, and you know what? It wasn't all that far away from the top 2. If you know your Sega, then you might have been able to guess what the top 2 was going to be. There's certainly 2 System-16 titles that particularly stand out from all the others. And second place goes to one of the most popular beat-em-ups out there, Golden Axe. There seemed to be a big 3 of beat-em-ups all released in 1989 that took the genre into the stratosphere. This, Capcom's Final Fight, and Konami's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Golden Axe is, by far, my favourite of the 3. It actually might be the arcade that I'm legitimately the best at. I still can't quite complete it on one credit, but I can get quite far, almost to the end of the second to last stage. Just those bloody skeletons always get in the way. I've played the game to death in many forms, mostly as Tyrus Flare, and it's still one of those games that doesn't get old. Probably the first game in its genre to really strike me, even before I started going into arcades, on the Spectrum and all of that. This is one of the first games that I truly remember blowing me away, and it was always going to be near or even at the top. However, today, the prize goes to the original Shinobi. Again, like a lot of System-16 titles, the presentation might not be saying all that much. There are many who would say that the sequels on the Mega Drive and what have you are much better games, and they're absolutely right about that. This cannot stand up to something like Revenge of Shinobi. It's an annoying bastard at times, and exceptionally cruel in that it waits until the very final level to then suddenly take continues out from under you, in a game of one-hit deaths. But this was such a formative game. I have told this story before, but back when I was very young, we had a video rental shop at the end of my road. They had an arcade machine, Shinobi. I used to drag my dad to this shop basically every night, not to rent videos of course, but just to play bloody Shinobi. After a while I could get through the first 2 stages and most of the third pretty handily. Not too bad an achievement considering how tough the game can be. But then, Mandara. Every time. That goddamn wall of evil Buddhas would just about always destroy me. I think I only got past it once or twice, never quite figuring out the trick to beating it. That's one of my very first gaming memories, it has to be said. Now some people do complain that these lists I make are a lot about nostalgia, but then what on earth else would I have to say if they weren't? I'd just be saying that every game has good graphics and good gameplay before moving on. It's these memories that help make the arcade experience what it is, what it was, and give what could just be a good but generic side-scroller a very special place. Shinobi was never not going to be number 1. And with that, another list is in the books. Next time, how about we go a bit more into Sega's present with models 1, 2 and 3? I think that's a good idea, don't you? Anyway, bye for now. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Now if you liked this video and you generally like what you see, why don't you press that like button? Why don't you hit that subscribe and click the bell and all that other vlogger shit? Do all of that. Follow me on Twitter, where I'm posting all the time pretty much. And if you really like what I do, why don't you have a look at my Patreon? You can find other stuff there, exclusive stuff, wrestling documentaries and other cool things. And you could also join this cool list of people right here. Alexa Jones Gonzalez, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Arcade LY Webmaster, Asobi Kwan DX, Brian Henniger, Chris Conrad Pritchard, D. Xalior, Rimwon Sutter, Dagorath Dungeon Keeper, Daniel Lomes, Danny Wolfers, Dave Cork, David Rose, Dinty76538, Dustin Cooper, Gary Samaden, Geordie Alex, Glunfef, Jay is Manchild, James Brown, Jace Alexander, Jeff Ladd, Lucas Kligowski, Matthias Gramzo, Mike Clayton Travis, Martin Pataki, Nate Milbank, Piotr Margel, Ren Bimon, Robert DeFelice, Rusty Kelly, Seth A. Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stuart Christopher Brownlee, Tariq Amir, Tim Wald, Yoko Operator, to all of them and to all the rest of the glorious community. Thank you so much, and goodbye.